it was rather quiet here because there were no fights. We were only occupied by the Germans. And we had rather few Germans in occupation because they were spread all over Europe. And we usually had older soldiers in charge of the administration. And they were rather kind to the population because they wanted to be accepted by the population. We also had the Gestapo, now whether you are familiar, Geheimstaatspolizei, the Nazi police, very dangerous when there was an action by the resistance, but it was not every day. It was quite in mid-44. From mid-44, almost every day, we had groups of hundreds of bombers flying to bomb the German towns. B-17, flying fortresses, B-24. I don't know whether you can imagine what it is to see hundreds of bombers. Today they bomb 2 jets, 4 jets, here hundreds of bombers. It was during the day. At night it was the British Royal Air Force. They were better equipped for night bombardment than day and night bombers in the sky. Flying in the opposite direction had the German V1s, the bus bombs, self-propelled rocket flying to destroy the British towns. I remember the first we saw. It was flying very loud with a terrible noise. Once you have heard a V1 in your life, you never forget it. It was what we call the pulse jet. And we very quickly learned that it was dangerous when the engine stopped. There were a sign it was going to crash. They were not supposed to crash it. There were so many breakdowns, they crashed too early. It was terrifying. First liberation in September 44, easy operation for the Allied troops because the Germans were fleeing. I remember the American troops, they were not even deployed. They were in columns on the roads, and we spent hours and hours cheering the American soldiers. And they were dropping chocolate, biscuit, chewing gum. It was a great period. When I was a boy, I have seen only American soldiers, with an exception in our village. For several weeks, we had a Canadian forestry company. They were there to work with the American engineers. We enjoyed their presence because some of them could get by in French coming from Quebec. And language was a barrier, of course, at that time. Between September, first liberation, and December, Battle of the Bulge, we had almost a normal life. For everyone, the war was over. We were going to school. And after school, we had an additional job, especially the boys. We visited our American friends because they wanted to exchange their K rations against eggs, potatoes, and so on. And we were purchasing for them. And had always an additional request. They wanted to have cognac, for the reminder from Normandy. And we were doing the same job for the Canadians. Battle of the Bulge, it was quite different. I remember the day of the German attack. Her brother was 11, I was 9. We went to school, and the teacher was standing in front of the school, and he said, "Don't be scared, return home, you'll come back later." Yes, we came back almost 1 year later, the longest holiday of my life. Arriving home, the first Germans were there, just like on a war movie, on a sidecar. 2 of them, rather kind, they gave cigarettes to my father. They could speak French fluently, probably had been in occupation in Belgium before. And I said, "We promise to be back, here we are." That was our first contact, not so bad. Progressively, we'll be completely occupied. When I say completely, you had Germans from the kitchen to the attic. We had taken all the beds, and we were sleeping on the floor side by side with the German soldiers. Beginning of the occupation, we had the Wehrmacht, the regular German army. They were nervous but had respect for the rules of war. My mother was obliged to cook for them, but we also received part of the food, and they were fair. A bit later, we received an additional SS detachment. Nobody knew anything about organization, but everyone was able to see that these Germans were completely different. Black uniform, very young, excited, arrogant, priority on everyone. It was an army inside the army. They were even hated by the other Germans. We have been warned by the other Germans not to have any contact with these guys, they were dangerous. When I studied military history at the military academy later, I could identify that SS unit, and maybe you heard about them. There was a horrible war crime in Oradour-sur-Glane. It's a small village close to Limoges in France. That's the village where they burned 500 people in the church. Never heard about that? It's a horrible war crime. It was the 2nd Panzer SS Division, Das Reich. Then we had a detachment from that division. Surprisingly, during the Battle of the Bulge, they didn't commit any war crime because clever enough to know that there was an inquiry in progress, better to keep quiet during the Battle of the Bulge. My father was a ranger, a forester, and for that reason our house was at some distance from the village. We had no running water, we had only a well for water. Before leaving, the Germans had taken all the water from the well. And suddenly, the next day, it was very quiet, all the Germans had disappeared. My father went outside to pick up some clean stout to melt it, to make a hot beverage, and a first shell fell, and he received a shrapnel in the chest. He could run home, kissed each of us without saying a single word, fell on the ground, he was dead. We went to the basement, praying, crying, whatever you want, and after a while we heard a hello. The Americans are there. No, it was an SS, with his revolver in his hand, and he stood in front of us for a long time. My mother trying to explain that her husband had just been killed, and eventually he disappeared. I think I understood much later. Probably he didn't want to kill us. He wanted to make sure that no Germans were hiding to surrender us. My post-war understanding. We returned to the basement. Once again a herald said that SS is back, no to American soldiers. They searched the basement to make sure there were no Germans, then became kind, giving chocolate, biscuit, and they explained that our house was a place, it was burning. We didn't know because we were in the basement. And they decided to evacuate all the family on a jeep. I had 2 brothers, a sister, my mother, and I was sitting on the hood of the jeep. Now, a boy sitting on the hood of a jeep. And we drove to the next village where my grandmother had a small house, and on both sides of the road, you had German prisoners of war. Nobody to guard them. They wanted to surrender. For them, the war was over. They get rid of their weapons and they were sure to survive. You never forget such picture. After the battle, as we had lost everything, we were allowed to go to the American kitchen after the troops to get some food. And we discovered the American food. It was in the church. Everything was in the church, kitchen, command post, aid station. And we discovered the American food, a bit surprising for us. Chocolate pork, corned beef, pancakes almost every day. But we were happy to receive something. Sometimes chocolate, but a word about chocolate. You know that Belgium is famous for chocolate? American chocolate was different. It was the D ration. We understood why they were giving their chocolate. It was quite impossible to eat. It was so hard. But you had the number of calories to survive 24 hours. The same for the biscuits from the ration. Quite impossible to eat. But anyway, we tried to grate them. That was so special. To melt them with milk, that was the solution. After the battle itself, we had a long holiday, and we were continuously playing on the battlefield. All the wreckage were still there. The trucks, the tanks, the planes. It was a great period for the boys, especially. Unfortunately, we had a lot of accidents. I shouldn't be here. I was always with my 2 best friends. The only day I was absent when I came back, both of them had been killed, playing with ammunition, explosion, and so on. Next September, very bad news, back to school. We couldn't believe it, back to school. But we had an additional day off, because the minesweepers came to clean the battlefield, and they knew that the children knew all the good places. They paid a visit to the school, and we spent a full day with them, showing the grenades, the shells, and that's the end of my walk. We had also maybe something funny. I explained that we were sleeping on the floor, side by side with the Germans, but the Germans were covered with lies. Consequence, we were also covered with lies. And once in a while, we were treated at the American aid station in the church with DDT, completely wild, all the population at the same time. The lice were killed, of course, but 10 days later, they were bad because the eggs were not destroyed. And then people at that time had, almost each family had an oven to bake bread. When the oven was still hot, not too hot, they put all the clothes inside. Very efficient, with the consequence that we were all walking with our burned clothes, because it was very often too hot, of course. Now